Hello folks, in today's guide we are diving into absolutely everything you need to know when just starting out in Hell Is Us. I complete the full game on the hardest difficulty and have racked up 50 hours so far. I've streamlined this entire guide including timestamps for all the main sections, so do feel free to skip ahead. There are a few minor gameplay spoilers throughout. I won't be touching on the story or spoiling anything beyond important gameplay mechanics, so for the most part you will be fine, but a minor warning nonetheless. And finally, there's a Games Planet link below for 15% off either the standard or deluxe editions for PC, so do feel free to use it. That is pretty much just about it for the intro, so let's get started. Now, to start us off, we have one of the most important subjects to discuss, which would be progression and how best to approach moving the story forward. For the most part, you are free to go and do whatever you want within Hell Is Us. However, if you progress the story past certain milestones, it can cause the game to make a small jump in time, which can then lead to certain side quests failing entirely. As a completely made up example, you may speak with an NPC and they remark that they are starving and will likely die soon as a result. If you were to progress the main story too far, it's likely that upon returning to this NPC, you'll find their corpse and the side quest will fail. This isn't a strict rule, however, as you can and will meet NPCs very early on that hint at needing specific items, and then upon returning to them after progressing the main story past one of these milestone points, they will still be there and a side quest will still be available. Now, when I say side quests, I'm more specifically referring to good deeds, as it does appear that these are the only type of side content that can be failed, and failure seems to be based entirely around progressing too far past being able to help them. Now, there are no indicators that you will be progressing time, and the ways in which you do so also do not follow a strict pattern. To make this abundantly clear, you can still do things like leave a region entirely and go and explore elsewhere. However, if you happen to progress the main story past one of these milestone points, then certain good deeds will very much fail. As for which ones specifically, it tends to be those that are based around time being of the essence. However, again, there is no strict pattern, and ultimately, I feel some of these things lean very heavily into replaying the game with the wealth of knowledge you amassed on your first playthrough, as 100% completion may be a little bit tough to achieve if you did not previously have this information, and even then, it's possible you may just fail certain good deeds due to not realizing you had progressed the story too far. It's a bit of a complicated one to explain. I was under the impression early on that I could return to these NPCs and complete the good deeds whenever I liked, but it's very much not the case, and there's no strict outline of what needs to be done and by when. Now, very early on, you'll unlock the APC, and this acts as your mobile hub, but beyond this, you'll also eventually unlock the Blacksmith, the Watcher's Nest, and the Researcher, and all three are unlocked by progressing the main story. The Blacksmith being the most important early on, as you'll need this to increase your weapon's grade, and by doing so, you'll increase its max level, as well as be able to infuse it with any of the 4 different emotion types, which then allow glyphs of the same type to be used with that weapon also. The Blacksmith can also be used to create consumable items, and additional teachings can be given over time, which upgrade the Blacksmith and allow it to do things like convert shards to higher tiers and unlock higher tier consumables to craft, etc. And finally, the Blacksmith can be unlocked without jeopardizing any of the good deeds, so do feel free to follow the main story up till this point without worrying about potentially failing anything else. The Watcher's Nest is essentially an NPC you can return to after completing specific tasks, and upon doing so, you'll be rewarded various pieces of gear, ranging from weapons to relics and glyphs, and this is essentially one of the core ways you'll acquire the best gear available. So, in a nutshell, just remember to return here often, as these upgrades are almost all unique and will expand your combat options quite a bit. As far as I know, you can progress the main story to this point without jeopardizing any of the good deeds. However, I'm not 100% certain, so over the coming days, I'll get confirmation on this and will leave additional info in a pinned comment below. The Researcher is the final upgrade NPC you'll unlock, and they mostly serve to reward exploration and provide additional context to the game's overall lore. However, upon researching enough items, you will periodically unlock the combinations to specific doors, which fortunately enough come with some additional information to the door's exact location. So combining this with your own knowledge is usually enough. These locked doors are also very important, as they act as the other main way of acquiring unique upgrades and gear, so I do heavily advise that you track these down as soon as you acquire the combination. In a nutshell, the Blacksmith will serve as your main upgrade station, whilst the Watcher's Nest and Researcher will act as your 2 main ways of acquiring much better gear and upgrades along the way. Now, when it comes to weapons, we have four main weapon types: the sword, greatsword, twin axes, and polearm. Now, first things first, weapons level is incredibly important. You'll need to slay enemies and collect experience in order to level these up, and by doing so, you'll increase each weapon's individual attack damage, and this is incredibly important in terms of keeping up with enemies as the game progresses. All four weapon types have their own attack patterns, speed, and unique pros and cons. For these examples, I'll use four weapons that are all level 10, and you'll see how they differ in terms of speed, damage, parry potential, limbic theft, max limbic energy, and guarding ability. The sword is quite solid for single target damage, offering a decent range between speed and power, and its charged attack has some solid range too, with this being one of the strongest weapons in terms of raw damage. The twin axes offer the fastest attacks at the cost of lesser damage, but they are typically less committed to attacking and can dodge out easier because of this, with their charged attack also being very good for single targets. The polearm has relatively good speed and range, but doesn't have as much damage as some of the other weapons. It's good for groups of enemies and remaining quite nimble, with its charged heavy attack having good range and area of effect. And then the greatsword is the slowest but most powerful of all the weapons, naturally having the highest raw damage but lacking in most other areas other than range. Its charged attack doesn't have much range, but overall the final attack in its light combo is very strong due to its damage and can oftentimes hit multiple enemies. All of these weapons can be imbued with one of four emotions, however this does not affect their stats in any way. So for example, a blue and red sword, both at level 10, will have identical stats. Whichever emotion you've imbued the weapon with will dictate which glyphs it can have slotted, so combining all of these factors will very much determine that specific weapon's preferred playstyle. This may sound a little bit definite, but fortunately the game is designed around experimenting and finding what's best for you, such as you'll very quickly find multiple versions of the same limbic weapon type, and eventually you'll more or less find each individual variant throughout the game anyway, meaning you won't restrict yourself too much by committing to certain choices. To touch on glyphs, we basically have 5 different types, being all 4 colours and then neutral, and then we have 5 types of glyphs per category, and then 3 tiers of upgrade for each. So 75 to find in total, however only 25 are truly unique. They behave quite differently from one another, with red having aggressive and both single target and area of effect abilities, whilst green has some tactical and evasive options instead. I recommend experimenting, as you will not know what you like until you try it. Just be sure to check how the ability is actually used, as it may need to be charged and released, placed and then activated later, or simply just pressed once. As a final few side notes, you cannot upgrade these glyphs, instead you will have to find them, and oftentimes this will be through either the Watcher's Nest or researcher NPCs. The neutral glyphs can also be used with all weapon types, and these are quite solid and varied too. I'm throwing together a much deeper combat guide focused on the game's combat and weapons, but that's about all of the basics that you will want to know when just first starting out. Now, the basic setup for combat is light and charged heavy attacks. The light attacks will reward limbic energy on hits based on your weapon's limbic theft, whereas the charged heavies will require charging before being able to be used, and all of them have different tiers of strength that can be activated when charged for longer. And they all require limbic energy to be used, costing more dependent on the strength of the charge. For defense, we have dodging, blocking, and parrying. Dodging is just dodging. It costs a little bit of stamina to do so, and there's no such thing as perfect dodging, etc. Blocking also requires stamina per attack blocked, and you will still receive a little bit of damage. And parrying cannot be used against all attacks. Instead, you can only parry attacks that first show this red glow, and you parry them by activating block once you see this red glow appear. It can be as soon as you see the glow or right at the very last millisecond. It doesn't matter so long as you press block whilst the enemy is still glowing red. Trying to parry enemy attacks that do not glow red will not work, and you'll just block them instead. We have 4 weapon abilities and 4 drone abilities, meaning we have 8 in total. Starting with the weapon, as mentioned before, each weapon can have 3 glyphs slotted, with its options being 5 from its own colour, and then the 5 neutral glyphs. So 10 options for each weapon in total. You can equip these in any order, however only one can be used on a weapon at once, basically meaning weapons can't share the same glyphs. The 4th ability slot will be your relic, which are essentially pieces of gear that offer very strong buffs or abilities mid-combat, such as stunning or enemies or making you invulnerable to damage, etc. The relic does have a cooldown, however all glyph abilities will cost limbic energy. For the drone abilities, we have roughly 8 or so to choose from, and these range from aggressive to defensive, basically giving you various other options during combat. However, the drone can only be used on one ability at once, so if you send it off to distract an enemy and then immediately use another drone ability, it will stop distracting the enemy and do the second ability instead. And finally, the drone does not require limbic energy and instead has its own cooldowns. Now, in regards to general progression, despite the game approaching things from the mysterious angle it does, content is still very much divided into its own category. We have the main story, good deeds, mysteries, limbic rods, and research codes. As mentioned before, it appears that good deeds are the only type of content that can be failed, and everything else can essentially be done at your own pace. However, these mysteries can often reward upgrades you won't find anywhere else. These objectives and puzzles can be a little bit overwhelming at times, especially if you run through the game and don't take your time whilst exploring areas, and the game will reward you for paying attention. As a few examples, you may find a locked safe or car along your travels, and then when within a completely different region, you may find a key or code, along with a note hinting at the connection between the two. Whether you discover the clue first and then discover the lock and try your luck, or if you discover the lock first and then eventually find the key to then vaguely remember the lock from a previous region, will very much come down to your own individual progression. Along with all of this, the actual information you are required to pay attention to sometimes is not as obvious as you may think. As somewhat of an actual example, there was a puzzle where I had to find a code by using nearby points of interest scattered around a building. First glance, it did appear that all of the points of interest had the answers I needed. However, upon rereading the original clues over and over again, I realized that it mentioned one of the points of interest that was due to be changed with something else entirely, and the correct code did reflect this. However, the change hadn't been physically made, and I had to go find this information elsewhere to find the correct combination. The point of me saying this is, oftentimes reading the entirety of clues is necessary in order to find out the small nuances to solutions. In addition to all of this, despite having no solid structure for these puzzles, the inventory system does have some structure we can depend upon. Within the research tab, we can track any codes we've received, and it gives some info regarding the door's actual location. The same does apply to limbic rods. Simply look at any you've collected to see some info on what it actually unlocks. The good deeds can kind of be tracked, but you won't receive any info. Instead, you'll be dependent on looking over specific items, your own memory, and intuition. So completing them can be a bit hard to track at times. And the same goes for mysteries. You can kind of track them, but you won't be given any information outside of whether you've completed them yet or not. The best you have is the exploration items tab within the menu, where items will give some info as to where you found them, but you'll once again be dependent on memory and your own intuition. What can help is you can favorite items as and when you find them to help keep track of things, and then you can possibly unfavorite them when you're quite convinced you don't need them anymore. The same goes for being able to place certain clues within your hotbar so as to make them easier to view as and when you're solving puzzles. These options will ultimately require some extra effort from yourself, and they do add another layer of micromanagement. I did only use them a little bit, but from what I experienced, it did seem to at least help me keep track of things a little bit better. Now, I've gone ahead and thrown a bunch of different topics within this one section that I will quickfire through right now. Enemies will only respawn when you travel between regions. You can stop them from respawning entirely by closing that region's time loop or loops, but to do this, you'll first have to progress the main story, where it will be explained further. To close a time loop, you need to defeat all of its guardians, which can be tracked down using an item you'll receive from the main story. However, just being thorough when exploring areas and not skipping fights will usually do the trick, and time loop guardians also do not respawn whatsoever. When closing the loop, you'll need one of 3 different items, and it states in the loop's name exactly what item you'll need. The game can be continued once completed, so if you do not complete 100% before finishing the story, you will be free to go back and do everything else, except for good deeds, which seem to be mostly time sensitive and will need to be completed whilst playing through the story. Weapons and glyphs do fall off, so you will want to ensure you level your weapons and use the highest tier glyphs that you do have available. And this also goes for the drone's upgrades too. The scaling can be noticed most when fighting enemies of different ranks, so do pay attention to their rank of either 1, 2 or 3, with 1 dropping small shards, 2 dropping medium, and 3 dropping large. There are some options within the settings that allow you to do things such as turn on directional audio, which can be very useful for puzzles and certain fights later on in the game. Additionally, there are options within here for players to adjust the difficulty settings, making enemies respawn upon death, as well as losing any experience and shards gained since then too. There are 1 or 2 standout moments within the game's story that you'll be required to use either directional audio or your own headphones, and without either of these two, you will find the challenge itself very difficult. It is also not very obvious that you need to use either of these options at that particular moment in time, so just try to remember that this is an option and it certainly has its uses. Or you could just simply use headphones instead. Anyway, that would be it for this one, folks. I'll be back over the coming days with plenty more Halazus guides and news, and I do have a range of guides and news videos on the channel already, so do feel free to stop on by and check things out. Otherwise, thanks for watching, folks, and until next time, Peace.